Today's video is sponsored by Picker's Grip. Stop dropped picks and pick rotation while playing with Picker's Grip. Made with all natural ingredients in Virginia. Check out their website to order. When you support my sponsor, this also supports my channel, and it's very much appreciated. You like loud? What guitar player doesn't like loud, right? Well, you asked for it, you got it. This is my list of the top 10 loudest amplifiers ever. When I recently did the video of the greatest rock amps ever, a viewer commented that he would like to see a list of the loudest amps ever, and I thought that was an excellent idea. So, I have compiled together a list of the loudest amps ever in history, some of which I have experienced, some of which I have not, some of which, fortunately, I have not. And that is the list that I'm going to share with you here today. This list is not at all about tone. Some of these amps do indeed sound far better than others, depending on who you ask. This is strictly about pure power. Let's get to it. Number 10, the Sunn 200S. As the name implies, this is a 200 watt all-tube power head that came out, I believe, in the late 1960s, early 1970s. The 200S has a mere 3 knobs on it, I believe, and I think it was a later generation of it that came out called the 2000S that had 4 knobs on it, and that's pretty much what it did. It was marketed primarily to bass players, but as is usually the case with anything tubes in it, guitar players tended to gravitate towards it as well. And because of that, it became known as a great guitar amplifier, primarily for clean tones, and today it is extremely popular among vintage tone freaks, and the Doom crowd seems to really like these as well. I got to hear one of these at the store I was at one time in my life, and just for kicks, we cranked it up, and I think I got it up to about 3 before I was told by a superior that that's enough, we know it works. Number 9, the Diezel Herbert. Or, as I discussed in my last Know Your Troll video, though this was not a troll that left this comment, as a viewer mentioned the last time I talked about the Diezel Herbert, apparently in German, over in Germany, it is actually pronounced Hey Bear. However, another viewer from Germany later commented and said that it was also pronounced Herbert over there, I guess, depending on who you ask. So maybe we'll get lucky and the greatest German YouTuber that I know of by the name of Henning Pauly will comment on this video and enlighten us, as he is very fluent in both English and German. And guitar amps. The Herbert is an all-tube amplifier of up to 180 watts. That is insane amounts of power. I have gotten to play a Herbert a few times in my life. It is the heaviest sounding amp that I have ever heard, and it didn't seem to matter how loud we cranked it up. It still stayed tight and didn't get muddy, and it just sounded like this amp is just meant to be pushed. Seriously, one of the coolest amps I have ever run across. I want a Diezel Herbert bad. But they're also $5,000, so that's probably not going to happen. Number 8, Crate Blue Voodoo 300. Probably the most popular amplifier the Crate ever put out was indeed the Blue Voodoo series, and they've made several different versions of it. It was an all-tube amplifier. I personally, my first tube amp was in fact the Blue Voodoo 120. I've always thought of that amp as basically a poor man's JCM 900 because, you know, they had a lot of the same, they were very similar for a number of reasons. However, later on in the life of the Blue Voodoo, they came out with a 150 watt all-tube version, and at the same time, I believe, they also came out with a 300 watt version, and that one is ungodly loud. I have only run across one of these amps before in my life, and I've been trying to track one down ever since, and they just never come up. Like, ever. They hardly, people that have them hoard them, and, I don't know if there's just not that many of them out there because they didn't sell very well, because where are you going to unleash 300 watts all tube? or or some people who just realize that they're actually really really cool and don't want to let loose of them. To be honest, I don't know what I would do with 300 all tube watts either, but I have a soft spot in my heart for crate amplifiers, in particular the Blue Voodoo. Number 7, Fender Bassman 100. This amplifier started out life in the late 1969, early 1970s as the Super Bassman. Of course, the Fender Bassman had been around for upwards of 20 years at that point, the original Bassman combo, but this was a big 100-watt tube head. And amps, this was at a particular time in history when the full stacks were beginning to become very, very popular, more and more popular every single year, and tube heads were all the rage to go on top of them. So, in order to compete with some of the other tube heads that were coming out on the market, such as, well, I'm not going to mention any of them because I'm about to mention them here later on in this list, but there are a lot of tube heads that were coming out. Many of them were designed for, some of them were geared strictly towards bass, some of them were geared towards guitar, some of them were geared towards both. This is primarily supposed to be a bass head, and again, 102 watts in a bass head is a lot of power. There's been a lot of different versions of the Bassman 100 that have come out since then. I don't believe that they are currently in production. However, I would not put it past Fender to bring them back yet again here at some point down the road. Vintage Bassman 100 heads are actually pretty easy to find. They're actually relatively affordable on the used and vintage markets. They're still popular among a lot of players today. Number 6, the Ampeg Super Vacuum Tube. Super Vacuum Tube, of course, being abbreviated down to SVT, which is what it is known as today. The SVT, again, this is the high-powered amplifier that came out in the late 60s, early 70s that everybody was trying to compete with. This one originally came loaded with, I believe they were called the 6146B power tubes. Great big bottles, and this thing put out 300 watts. This amp was not flawless in the beginning. The Rolling Stones were among the first ones to use this amp. Matter of fact, they were probably the first ones to use this amp, as they were their 1969 tour. They were using the prototypes of the SVTs, and they actually had an amp engineer from Ampeg that tagged along with them for that entire tour, and his job was to swap out tubes when they blew up, to take care of blown transformers. These amps did have some problems early on. However, all of those problems were soon ironed out, and the SVT and several different versions of it are still around today. Today, that amp is referred to as the SVT Classic. They also make the very similar SVT V4B. These amps are primarily marketed as bass amplifiers today. However, guitar players have always had a fondness for them, starting with none other than the Rolling Stones. I've talked about the SVT before on this channel, and I've also mentioned that if you plug a Les Paul straight into an SVT Classic running into an SVT 810 cabinet and crank everything, it is a really, really cool guitar tone that you may not have ever experienced before. I love the SVTs. Number 5, Fender Twin Reverb. For most of its history, the wattage on the Twin Reverb has varied quite a bit since it was first released in 1950. The original Twin came out in 1952, I believe. And for the most part, they've all been roughly 85 watt amplifiers. 85 watt 212 combos. There's been a few versions that have gone all the way up to, I think, 130, and I think they've gone down as low as like 60 something watts. I can't recall what the lowest is, but for the most part, they've all been about 85 watts, including the 65 reissue version and the recent 68 reissue version that you can buy on the market today. Why did I add the Twin Reverb to this list? I'll tell you why. If you follow this channel, I got to assume that you are familiar with the Marshall JCM 800, as it is one of my favorite amplifiers, and I talk about it all the time. Pretty loud amp, right? I'll tell you what, if you ever get the chance, take a JCM 800 half stack and turn up every knob to 10. Then take a Twin Reverb combo, set it right next to it, and turn every knob up to 10. The Twin Reverb will eat that JCM 800. The Twin Reverb at a lot of volumes, but especially completely cranked, will make your ears bleed. They are insanely loud amps. Number 4, a Hiwatt DR-201. I had a tough time deciding which Hiwatt amp to put on this list because, quite frankly, they're all loud, and I almost went to the DR-103, which is probably the most famous and the most popular. However, the DR-103, I believe, is only 100 watts. The DR-201, on the other hand, was 200 watts and insanely loud. Hiwatt amplifiers are actually really unique as far as just about any amplifier goes, because the louder, unlike most other amps, the louder you crank them up, they don't break up and they don't get dirtier and they don't get grittier. They stay clean even at insanely high levels. So if you take that ridiculously clean, crisp tone and put 200 watts of all-tube power behind it, don't stand too close. Number 3, Orange Thunderverb 200. Ever been locked in a cage with a rabid wolverine? Well, that's what this amplifier sounds like. Remember that Diezel Herbert that I mentioned earlier on this list? Diezel Herbert is definitely the heaviest sounding amp that I have ever heard. The second heaviest sounding amp I have ever heard is the Orange Thunderverb 200. These things, even cranked just a little bit, will rip your face off. I know the Reverb has always been the more popular Orange amp model, but I have always preferred the Thunderverb. And the Thunderverb, again, that distortion was, until I got the chance to play a Diezel Herbert, the Thunderverb was in fact the heaviest sounding distortion, the heaviest amp I had ever heard. And it's different sounding than the Herbert in that Orange amps are just tend to be really dark sounding anyway. So this type of heaviest sounding amp that I'd ever heard just hits you right in the chest. Number 2, Marshall Major. Marshall Major actually started out life as the Marshall 200. Again, this amp came out in the late 60s at a time when more louder was more better. And this, of course, was Marshall's entry into that arena. Marshall amplifiers are insanely loud anyway, and this one was no exception. In fact, this one put the rest of them to shame. The Marshall Majors were not without their problems, especially early on. They were notorious for blowing output transformers and among other things, and they just blew up all the time because nothing with that much power had ever been made before, at least not by Jim Marshall. But eventually Jim Marshall figured out the tweaks that he needed to make in order for his 200 watt all-tube monstrosity to function properly. Marshall Majors don't pop up on the vintage market very often. I've only seen one in probably the last 15 years. I know Stevie Ray Vaughan used one in his live rig along with a couple of twin reverbs, or super reverbs or something, but he had a Marshall Major in his live rig as well. And I had a friend of mine that was telling me about these amps, and all of a sudden one day one came walking into the store that I was working at the time, and he had told me that they are ungodly loud. So I got the chance to plug it in, and I made it to about 1 o'clock before I bowed out. Quite honestly, the loudest amp I have ever experienced up that close. I don't know what I would ever do with that kind of power, but it was pretty cool. And number 1 on our list of top 10 loudest amplifiers ever is none other than the Fender 400 PS. I have to admit, this is an amp I've only heard about. I've never played one. In fact, I've never actually even seen one in person. This amp was originally announced at the 1969 NAMM show in Chicago. Apparently, the NAMM show used to take place in Chicago every year instead of LA. Upon announcing this amplifier, Fender actually had this thing running through 3 8x10 cabinets just to show off how loud this thing was. As the model name implies, it was even louder. With the stock tubes that came in this thing, it would easily crank up to about 435 watts. And if you changed out the tube type, there was a specific tube type that you could put in it that was similar to a KT88. That would push it all the way up, upwards of 480 watts. It did have a pretty cool concept, though, in that way that you could attenuate it. It had 3 speaker outputs on the back of it, and each speaker output would put out, a third of its overall power. So if you wanted to attenuate it by a third, just unplug one of the speaker cabinets. If you wanted to unplug it by 2/3, unplug 2 of them. That was as low as it would go, but especially for that time, in that era, that was a pretty cool concept. Especially if you were doing what Fender did and were lugging around 3 8x10 cabinets with it. Again, this amp came out in an era where refrigerator style amp stacks were all the rage, and again, more power was more better. It was primarily competing against the Ampeg SVT. However, unlike the SVT, Fender marketed the 400 PS primarily towards bass players. Just like all things tube, as I mentioned earlier, guitar players did eventually gravitate towards it as well, but I think it was still Fender's marketing towards bass players that eventually became the demise of the 400 PS. It didn't look as cool as the Ampegs, despite the way that they showcased it at the 1969 NAMM show. It actually came with the silver roller cart looking thing that had its advantages, made it easier to transport, and it also helped with airflow and cooling and that kind of thing. And eventually it was discontinued and was replaced with another model called the Fender 300 PS, which was obviously a little bit smaller and a little bit more practical. As I was researching amps for this video, I admit I had heard of the Fender 400 PS, but that was about the extent of my experience with them. As I said, I've actually never seen one before, but the 400 PS actually has a pretty cool history behind it, and apparently they are relatively affordable and attainable on the used and vintage markets today. So there you have it. That is all for this list. For those of you that griped at me in the comments section of my recent Christmas holiday video, here is the pop filter that you also desperately requested. Now I got this great big black dot in front of my face, and most likely you can see me from about here up, but I suppose you guys would rather hear me better than look at me. So thanks for that. What other insanely, ungodly, stupid loud amplifiers did I not include in this list? Please let me know down in the comments section below. I'll include links, various links as I can find them down in the description. You can also find various different ways to support this channel down in the description. And also down in the description, you can find links to the fine folks at Pickersgrip who sponsored both this t-shirt and this video. So please go check out Pickersgrip. It's a fantastic product. I very much enjoy it. And for as good of a product as it is, Billy Kochs, the founder and owner, is an even better guy. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next video.